Deep in the middle of the Indian Ocean, thousands of miles away from the nearest substantial landmass, lies a chain of islands you've never heard of. No, I'm not talking about the island from Lost. This isn't science fiction, but the island of Chagos truly is incredible. Now, why is this island so important, and why am I so fascinated with it? Well, let's start with some history. It's believed that the island chain of Chagos was well known about and explored by the neighboring Maldivian people for hundreds of years. The people of the Maldives inhabit a similar archipelago nation and have Indo-Aryan origins with significant Dravidian input. Even though the island was well known about and infrequently visited by Maldivian fishermen, people refused to settle there because of its remoteness, being hundreds of miles away from the main Maldivian island chain. Fast forward a few hundred years and you have famous Portuguese explorer Pedro de Mascarenhas, who the Mascarene island chain is named after, is credited with discovering the island in the mid-16th century. The island, however, was abandoned by the Portuguese, who saw no real tangible use for this lonely and isolated place. In the early 1700s, the island was surveyed and claimed by the French as a dependency of their neighboring colony of Mauritius. Because of Chagos' extreme isolation and relatively small size, being only 23 square miles, or about the same size as Manhattan and New York City, the French saw no real purpose for it other than farming and plantations. So only a few decades later, the few handful of French families that lived on the island imported a few dozen African slaves to help them on the plantations. Naturally, many of the African slaves had children with their French masters, as was extremely common in those days, as well as some Indian laborers that were brought onto the island, created a new hybrid ethnicity known as the Chagossians or the Îlois. The Chagossians spoke a creole language closely related to the language of the neighboring islands of Mauritius and Reunion, and after a relatively short period of occupation, the French emancipated all of their slaves throughout their empire in 1840, and most of the remaining French families on the island left to go back to France, seeing no real purpose there. However, their former slaves remained in the area, seeing the Chagos archipelago as their homeland. However, during the same time period, the island chain was actually claimed by Great Britain, who wanted to administer it as part of Mauritius, an island which they had just taken from the French. The British generally left the island alone with no real plans for colonization or settlement. They actually let their self-governing colony of Mauritius administer the Chagos archipelago, along with a couple surrounding islands of Rodrigues and Agalaga. In the meantime, the island's Creole population grew to around 5,000 people by the 1960s. But that actually changed in 1965 when the British government decided that they wanted the islands back, and they bought them from Mauritius for £3 million. Only a year later, in 1966, the British and American governments had come to an agreement where the American military would be able to use the main island of the Chagos archipelago, Diego Garcia, as one big military base. The island's seemingly isolated location was now seen as strategic by the American military, who wanted a failsafe in case India went red, much like China to the north. This was the height of the Cold War, after all, and India was showing increasingly socialist and Maoist leanings, and the US was afraid that they were going to develop the atomic bomb, which they eventually did in 1974. Under the British-American agreement, the United States Armed Forces were allowed to turn the main island of Diego Garcia into a functioning military base for up to 50 years until December 2016. A year after the agreement was signed in 1967, the entire native population of the archipelago of Chagos was forcibly moved off the island, mostly to Mauritius and the United Kingdom. At this point, the Chagossian people were already a well-established nation with their own culture, ethnicity, language, and even a church. Since 1973, the only permanent inhabitants of the island have been members of the US military, British administrators, and more recently contractors from South Africa and Asia. But whatever happened to the native Chagossians that populated the archipelago? Well, they number around 10,000 today, and around 70% of them live in Mauritius, with most of the rest living in Seychelles and the United Kingdom. The Chagossians that settled in Mauritius seem to be integrated a bit better since they share a common French Creole culture. However, those that went to the UK, mainly London, long for their homeland back, and they have frequent protests to have them relocated back to their island home. Well, 2016 came and went, and a British court ruled that the Chagossians could not return to the Chagos archipelago, opting instead to use a 20-year optional extension on the amount of time that the United States could use the island of Diego Garcia as a military base. So today, the sovereignty of the island is heavily disputed between the United Kingdom and the United States that are currently occupying it, and Mauritius, which actually claims it as part of its own territory. I haven't seen any polls discussing what the actual Chagossian diaspora want, but from what I've seen, they either want to become an independent country or be a part of Mauritius or Seychelles. Recently, in the 21st century, Diego Garcia has been used for troop deployment into Middle Eastern countries such as Iraq and Afghanistan. But I'm really not sure what its purpose is at the moment and what it will be used for the next 20 years until 2036. And it's actually unknown whether the island chain will actually be returned to the native islanders by the end of the lease at this time. And really, what is there for them to return to? Their homes were mostly demolished and abandoned in lieu of the military occupation in the 1960s. It'll take a lot of effort to rebuild and reform this very interesting nation if and when the time arrives. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.